would have to do. Sometimes this intimidation campaign has been aimed at the nominee. Colleagues, including my friend, the Democratic leader, have tried to get Judge Kavanaugh to withdraw from this process because of these uncorroborated and sometimes absolutely ridiculous allegations. And when that didn't work, then the far left tried to bully and intimidate members of this body, Republican United States senators. They've tried to bully and intimidate them. One of our colleagues and his family were effectively run out of a restaurant in recent days by these people. Another reported having protesters physically block his car door. And some have seen organized far-left protesters camp out at their homes. I'm not suggesting we're the victims here, Mr. President, but I want to make it clear to these people who are chasing my members around the hall here, or harassing them at the airports, or going to their homes, we'll not be intimidated by these people. There is no chance in the world they're going to scare us out of doing our duty. I don't care how many members they chase, how many people they harass here in the halls. I want to make one thing perfectly clear. We will not be intimidated by these people. This is all part of the organized effort to delay, obstruct, and intimidate, including those of us who will be voting this week. A few days ago, I did something I rarely do. I offered a prediction. I predicted that here, in the last few days before the Senate will vote on Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation, the Democratic Conference would continue to make good on their leader's promise and fight this nomination with everything they've got. I predicted that on a dime. The very supplemental background investigation for which my Democratic friends had clamored, Mr. President, would suddenly become insufficient. Suddenly become insufficient. That no matter what accommodations were made, no matter what agreements were reached, Senate Democrats would find more excuse to continue moving the goalpost one more time. Now, granted, this wasn't exactly a radical prediction. This body and this nation have spent months watching their friends across the aisle grasp at every imaginable excuse to delay this process and damage this nominee. So I felt pretty safe in saying the last goalpost would soon be on the move yet again. But even I wasn't sure it would happen this quickly, Mr. President. Let's start with the Democratic leader and the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. In a letter released on September the 23rd, they suggested that the FBI had ample time to conduct a supplemental investigation before the hearing that was scheduled just 4 days later. They insisted an inquiry would, quote, not take a tremendous amount of time. Democratic leader brushed aside the notion that this, the seventh background investigation of Judge Kavanaugh, would delay the process, saying, quote, it'll only take a few days, said the Democratic leader. It'll only take a few days. Well, that was, of course, before we agreed last Friday to delay proceedings no more than 1 week to accommodate just such an inquiry. So, naturally, we're now hearing a different tune. Yesterday, the ranking member stated her view that voting this Friday on Judge Kavanaugh's nomination as planned would be, I quote, too soon. Too soon. There go those goalposts again, Mr. President, moving right on down. In that same letter, the Democratic leader and the senior senator from California called for this supplemental investigation because, quote, conducting background investigations on nominees has long been the FBI's standard practice. Standard practice. Here's what standard practice means. The FBI conducts interviews, prepares a careful report, and makes it available for senators to review. Standard practice does not mean what the Democratic leader decided to demand for the first time yesterday, now that the FBI is concluding its review. You get the picture. As they conclude the review, it's not enough. That we have yet another delay, so FBI agents are made to appear, listen to this, Mr. President, for in-person briefings. And Democrats can cross-examine the agents to see if they're satisfied with how they did their job. Anybody surprised about this? There go those goalposts again. Well, guess what? Our Democratic colleagues have made it abundantly clear they will never, ever be satisfied. Not ever. Does anyone really think the same people who said any nominee of this president would result in the destruction of the Constitution will be satisfied? Does anyone really think the same people who called Judge Kavanaugh evil long before they heard one word of testimony from anyone is going to be satisfied? Does anyone really think that the same people who said their goal is to delay this nomination past the election are going to be satisfied? To ask the question is to answer it. So, if my friends across the aisle had their way, the goalpost on Judge Kavanaugh's nomination would be in another time zone. Another time zone by now. Our Democrat colleagues are quickly running out of material. One of their last efforts seems to be the new argument that, notwithstanding whether or not these allegations can be corroborated in any way, the real crime here is that Judge Kavanaugh stood up for his family and took umbrage at this disgraceful spectacle. He's now expected to witness this disgraceful spectacle and not get upset about it. I would ask any of my colleagues, how would you feel if your entire reputation had been destroyed in this mudslide, and be calm about it? For weeks now, the national media feeding frenzy has literally dragged Judge Kavanaugh and his family through the mud. He's been subjected to the most vile and disgusting accusations. His wife has been threatened. His young daughter is traumatized. In many instances, my Democratic colleagues have ushered on these absurdly disgusting accusations and tried to give them a veneer of credibility, specifically citing them now as a reason why Judge Kavanaugh should not be confirmed. Our Democratic colleagues are enabling this mudslide and encouraging it. And now the same Democratic senators have the temerity, Mr. President, to say Judge Kavanaugh disqualified himself for the Supreme Court because he got a little testy at the hearing. A little testy at the hearing after they drug him through the mud, because he told them how much damage these accusations have caused him and his family. Let's get one thing straight right now. I don't want to meet the man or woman who wouldn't be frustrated and angered by a coordinated strategy to destroy their good name on the altar of partisan politics. The Senate has received an incredible volume of testimony about Judge Kavanaugh's exemplary judicial temperament. We've heard from faculty of his alma mater who called him a fair-minded jurist who believes in the rule of law and commands wide and deep respect among his legal peers. And from his former law clerks who say, quote, he listens carefully to the views of his colleagues and clerks, even indeed especially when they differ from his own. Yet some still prioritize partisan point scoring ahead of Judge Kavanaugh's actual record. We've heard overwhelming testimony that Judge Kavanaugh's time on the federal bench has been defined by equanimity, even-handedness, and fair treatment of all parties. Mr. President, it's time to put this embarrassing spectacle behind us. The American people are sick of this display that's been put on here in the United States Senate in the guise of a confirmation process. The FBI is finishing up a supplemental background investigation. It will soon add this information to Judge Kavanaugh's file for Senators' consideration. This, Mr. President, is the standard practice. Then, pursuant to last week's agreement of a delay no longer than 1 week, the Senate will vote on this nomination this week. The Senate will vote on this nomination this week. When we do, we'll be voting on one of the most impressive, most stunningly qualified Supreme Court nominees in our nation's history. We'll be voting to confirm a new Supreme Court justice who possesses sterling academic credentials, widely acknowledged legal brilliance, an exemplary judicial temperament, and a proven commitment to complete fairness on the bench. That is exactly what the Senate will do this week.
Mr. President, first, I'm glad that the Majority Leader and I get along. I'm glad we're able to do certain things together, like the opioid bill and the appropriations bill. But that cannot hold me back from responding to the blatant falsehoods he tells day after day after day on this floor. First, from the man who single-handedly delayed the filling of Justice Scalia's seat for 10 months to complain about a 1-week delay to get the truth? Give me a break. It is classic diversionary, blame the other person tactics when he himself is the master of delay. It is galling, appalling to hear day after day the Majority Leader get on his high horse about delay when he almost invented the word when it comes to judicial nominations. Second, he blames Democrats for the delay, which is about the most blatant falsehood I have heard uttered on this floor in a long time. The Majority Leader knows darn well that he has the sole power to determine when to put the Kavanaugh nomination on the floor. He could have done it 2 weeks ago. He could have done it last week. He's now insisting he'll do it this week. Democrats have no say. He talked about an agreement that caused a week delay. Who was the agreement with? 3 Republican senators. The Majority Leader knows that it was Republicans who caused him to delay, both for the FBI investigation and for Judge Kavanaugh and Dr. Ford to testify. He didn't have to do that. He had the power. He's to blame for the delay, but he couldn't do anything otherwise because his own Republicans insisted on it. Again, it is a blatant falsehood. I'm so tempted to use the L word, but he's my friend, to say that Democrats caused the delay. Mr. Leader, assert your power to determine what's put on the floor and be a man up and say it's your decision, not ours. We have nothing to do with it. And third, he says one of the most qualified nominees we've ever seen. We know what's going on here. Everyone, including the majority leader himself, knows that Kavanaugh is a deeply flawed candidate for a whole lot of reasons. Knowing that, the majority leader and the Republican majority have to divert attention from Kavanaugh. So they're focusing on people who did nothing wrong, like Senator Feinstein, like Judiciary Democratic minority, like the Democratic Party. It's outrageous. But they know that Kavanaugh is not very good, and they know his testimony hurt him across America. I was talking to a CEO, a Republican of a major company, said his board was happening to watch the debate, and every one of them changed their mind after seeing Kavanaugh testify. They said, this guy doesn't belong on the bench, we can do better. That's the overwhelming reaction of Americans. Judge Kavanaugh hurt himself dramatically, permanently, by his screed, his nasty partisan screed. That's something of a new, unschooled, two-bit politician, not someone who wants to be on the Supreme Court of the United States. And he hurt himself. Leader McConnell knows that. The Republican leadership knows it. Donald Trump knows it. But they have to get the focus off Kavanaugh. And so they come up with these straw men and women. They come up with these false innuendos, distortions, and dishonesty. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. Now let me turn to the president. And let me condemn, in the strongest possible terms, the comments by President Trump last night about Dr. Ford. President Trump's outright mockery of a sexual assault survivor, riddled as it was with falsehoods. Let me say that again. President Trump's outright mockery of a sexual assault survivor, riddled as it was with falsehoods, was reprehensible beneath the office of the presidency and beneath common decency from one person to another. President Trump owes Dr. Ford an immediate apology. For too long, far too long, survivors of sexual assault have been afraid to come forward because they thought that powerful men would shout them down, and destroy their character. The President of the United States, the most powerful man there is, confirmed those fears for millions of women in the most despicable way possible. President Trump should send a message to the women of America right now that he's sorry for saying what he said about Dr. Blasey Ford, that survivors of sexual assault should not only be heard, but treated with dignity and respect and compassion. You don't have to believe everything Dr. Ford said, and I do, to refrain from the nasty, vicious attacks riddled with lies in sort of a mobocracy type way. And yet, Donald Trump shows no restraint, no regulator. He is the prime example of why the norms in America, regardless of politics, regardless of party, are declining. We don't hear a peep out of my colleagues on the other side, with a few notable and noble exceptions. He's ruining the norms of America. He's so degrading the way people treat each other. It's pathetic. And it does permanent damage to this republic unless his own party members or others close to him speak up. Anyone who watched Dr. Blasey Ford saw a credible, courageous woman who elected to relieve the worst night of her life because she felt a civic duty to come forward. That action took immense courage. She's not the first. This is not unusual anymore. We know thousands of women who were hurt and then afraid to come forward, mainly because they thought they would be ridiculed, disbelieved, just as President Trump appallingly and despicably, lowly did last night. Dr. Ford's actions took courage from a woman who admitted, she's far more honest than Donald Trump, who admitted that she was terrified to speak in public about her very private pain and trauma. I've been disappointed by President Trump's comments before, but this is a new low. President Trump should apologize immediately. I repeat that. And now, what will my colleagues on the other side of the aisle do? Ignore President Trump's comments, sidestep President Trump's comments, spend their time blaming Democrats, even though we had no say in the delay? That was 3 Republicans. We know what they'll do. It's shameful. The president is, day by day, tearing down the norms that have built this country up. We've had the greatest norms, the greatest character, the greatest behavior of any nation ever. But it's declining now because people of goodwill allow Trump to do it without criticizing him. And it's about time they did. It's about time they did. Now, shifting focus back to events here in Congress. We have to get back to reality and truth and focus on treating the Supreme Court nomination debate the right way. When all is said and done, this is about the nominee's credibility and temperament. I've said it before, I say it again. There are many who say what happened when someone was 15 and 18 doesn't indicate their personality and what kind of person they are when they are 53. While I believe Dr. Ford, and I believe what she said is very relevant, there are many who don't want to consider that. But there's an issue that should matter even to them, and that is the credibility and temperament of Judge Kavanaugh. This is what he is at 53. If he can't tell the truth about previous encounters, engagements, behavior, and activity, which we have found over and over and over again with Judge Kavanaugh, he doesn't deserve to be on the bench. That's why we need an FBI investigation. That's why Republicans stymied Leader McConnell in his headlong rush to have a vote and demanded an FBI investigation. It wasn't Democrats, we know that. Because they wanted to get to the truth. Because credibility of a justice on the Supreme Court is a very, very important characteristic. And right below it is temperament and lack of partisanship. And unfortunately, at least from initial indications, Judge Kavanaugh is not high on any of those 3 lists. That's why we need the investigation, and that's why we need it thorough. We need it to be thorough. But we still don't know how thorough of an investigation the FBI is conducting. As of last night, Dr. Blasey Ford and her list of corroborating witnesses have not been interviewed. While Deborah Ramirez has reportedly been interviewed, her attorney says a list of corroborating witnesses have not. NBC News is reporting that more than 40 people with potential information for the investigation have not been contacted for interviews by the FBI. I've heard the story over and over again. People call the tips line, that's what they're supposed to do, and they don't get a call back. This may be vital information. We want to know the truth. It can all be done in a week. The week that Senator Flake and Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski asked for. Not that Democrats asked for, although we certainly agree with it. But that's not what caused Leader McConnell to delay. And every Republican senator knows it. So that's why we need this to be a thorough investigation. Without a clear sense of what the White House has told the FBI to look at in this investigation, we have no idea if the FBI is doing a real investigation or simply preparing a fig leaf at the direction of the White House for Republicans to vote yes. I understand the difficulty of the FBI. I have a great deal of respect for Director Wray. He's been pushed around. They've been ridiculed by the president, brave men and women who risk their lives for us as part of law enforcement. But the FBI has a duty to do. And Director Wray has a duty to the reputation And if he's being constrained by the White House, he has an obligation to let us know. And certainly, Counsel McGahn has an obligation to let us know what constraints he has placed upon the FBI. So here's what needs to happen. First, the White House must publicly release in writing what the White House counsel has instructed the FBI to pursue. If the FBI is not interviewing these witnesses that Ms. Ramirez's attorney presented to them because Counsel McGahn or Donald Trump has said don't do it, we ought to know that. And certainly not just we ought to know that, the senators who requested the FBI investigation ought to know that. Second, Leader McConnell should arrange an all-senators briefing from the agent in charge of the investigation before the vote. We should know what he did and what he didn't do and why. And third, the findings of the FBI investigation upon completion should be released publicly, with any personal information redacted. This is not the usual practice, but it's been done in the past when it's needed, and it's sure needed now. The FBI should do it. These three steps would go a long way to ensure the public's faith that the investigation has been conducted fairly, fully, and properly. This debate, this nomination, Mr. President, is about whether Judge Brett Kavanaugh has the character, the credibility, the impartiality to serve on the nation's highest court. In order to be an effective judge at any level, you need to be impartial. You need to be dispassionate. We don't ask our judges to be perfectly neutral, but we can't tolerate judges who are nakedly partisan either. Judge Kavanaugh himself has said that most obviously a judge cannot be a political partisan. Those are his words, but that's just what he has shown us he is in his long history and now in his recent rant. The testimony Judge Kavanaugh prepared for the judiciary last Thursday, prepared testimony. This was not just on the spur. This showed who he was. And it was steeped in partisan resentment and acrimony. He tried to implicate sitting senators in a calculated and orchestrated political hit job. That's what he said to the senators he was interviewing. He was being interviewed by. He denounced left-wing opposition groups who don't have close to the power the hard right has had in pushing our Republican colleagues around to rush this nomination through. But we don't hear about them. And then, topping it off, he portrayed the recent allegations against him as revenge on behalf of the Clintons. I dare say that Dr. Ford didn't have the Clintons on her mind once when she wrestled and struggled with whether to come forward. It's an absurd charge. Absurd. He even told Democratic senators, what goes around comes around, which to many ears sounds just like a threat. A judge telling people what comes around goes around? What goes around comes around? A judge, a Supreme Court justice says that when he's nominated? We can certainly do better. Even if someone is with the same ideology as Kavanaugh is chosen, someone who doesn't do things like that should be before us. And I hope that person won't be chosen, of course, if he has Judge Kavanaugh's ideology, which is why one of the main reasons I was against him to begin with. And I should never forget. It's likely Judge Kavanaugh will greatly impede or eliminate a woman's right to choose. It's likely, or it's very likely, he will get rid of health care, including pre-existing conditions. It's likely he'll allow presidential overreach. Those three substantive bases motivated most of us to come out against Kavanaugh even before his awful testimony. I understand Judge Kavanaugh felt his character was under assault. I understand how he's feeling angry and upset. I understand responding to questions in the heat of the moment with words you might later regret. But these were prepared remarks. It takes a partisan to see a partisan conspiracy against him. As a conservative fellow at the Brookings Institute, former Kavanaugh defender Benjamin Wittes wrote in a column entitled, "I know Brett Kavanaugh, but I won't confirm him." Judge Kavanaugh's opening statement was an unprecedentedly partisan outburst of emotion from a would-be judge. I do not begrudge him the emotion, even the anger, but I cannot condone the partisanship, which was raw, undisguised, naked, conspiratorial from somebody who asks for public faith as a dispassionate and impartial judicial actor. His performance was wholly inconsistent with the Congress we should expect from a member of the judiciary. That's from somebody who's a conservative and a Kavanaugh supporter. The courage that a good number of both Kavanaugh's friends and observers like Wittes are showing in realizing that this guy's too much, I wish we saw a little more of that from the Republican side. Because they know deep in their hearts this guy shouldn't be on the bench. We know they know. Now, the judge's partisanship at a hearing raises questions, as I've mentioned. But the biggest issue against Judge Kavanaugh, in my judgment, is credibility. The number one issue. Does Kavanaugh always tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Whatever you think of what he did as a 17 or 18-year-old, what Judge Kavanaugh has said as a 53-year-old matters. Whether you think the 17 or 18-year-old behavior should be part of the decision, which I do, or whether you don't. The harsh fact of the matter is that Judge Kavanaugh has repeatedly danced around the truth on issues large and small. In 2004, his first confirmation hearings. 2006, his second, and now again in 2018. On things like what happened when he did in high school and college and law school, to things like grand jury proceedings and White House controversies. Again, he has danced around the truth and never been direct, and often tried to mislead. We cannot have a Supreme Court justice whose credibility is in doubt. That will hurt the nation for a generation. So I ask my colleagues, whatever you think about what Judge Kavanaugh did at 17 or 18, think about what he said at age 53. Think about the credibility of the man now as a grown adult and a judge. Think about whether we want to put someone who has been so partisan with questionable credibility on the court, or whether there is someone better. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, I unfortunately don't have enough time right now to respond to everything the Democratic leader has said, but I do want to say this. The most accurate statement that the minority leader made is he was against Judge Kavanaugh from the start. No one should be confused about this being a search for the truth. This is about search and destroy. Now, I think the Senate conducted itself appropriately. The Judiciary Committee conducted itself appropriately in giving Dr. Ford a chance to tell her story. I've said all along, I want Dr. Ford to be treated just the same way my daughters or my wife or my mother would be treated under similar circumstances. And I think we met that standard. But we know that the goalposts continue to be moved by our colleagues. This idea that you can assassinate a man's character, resulting in threats against his family, ruin his reputation and his future, and expect him to be a human punching bag and not respond forcefully, it's incredible to me. This should be about a fair process, but a fair process means that the people who ultimately decide should have an open mind at the beginning. You wouldn't want to walk into a courtroom and talk to a jury or a judge where the jury had already made up their mind. You would want them to listen to the evidence. That's what a fundamentally fair process means. And it also means that if somebody's going to make an accusation against an individual for a crime, which is what has been alleged against Judge Kavanaugh, that they would have to come forward with more than just an allegation. They'd have to come forward with witnesses, proof, evidence. Because under our Constitution, people are presumed to be innocent of crimes unless proven guilty. They are accorded due process of law, a fair hearing, a fair process. And unfortunately, as a result of the mishandling of Dr. Ford's confidential letter to the ranking member, contrary to her wishes and without her consent leaked to the press, she has been thrust into this three-ring circus. She was not told by her lawyers that the Judiciary Committee had offered to send a bipartisan team of professional staff out to her home in California to interview her confidentially. Why would her lawyers not tell her that? Because they wanted this three-ring circus? They wanted, despite Dr. Ford's wishes, not to be thrust into the spotlight? They evidently thrust her into that spotlight, raising the question in my mind, who are they working for? Are they actually working, these lawyers working for Dr. Ford? Or do they have another agenda and another client in mind? Well, the idea that now this has all come down to what somebody wrote in their high school yearbook is beyond parody. I mean, you can't make stuff like this up. And the judge, we know the judge is belligerent because he threw ice allegedly on somebody in a bar in college. Of course, the reporter who wrote that had previously sent out a tweet demonstrating his bias against Judge Kavanaugh. But now it's accepted as fact. And man, we're going to defeat this man because he threw ice on somebody when he was in college. Or we're going to go through his college yearbook. You know, I wonder what every senator in this chamber's college yearbook says, or high school yearbook, I should say. I hope that's not the standard. The Senate is an institution that operates based on precedent. If this is the precedent for future nominees, woe be to us, because we won't be able to recruit the best and brightest people to come serve in the judiciary or be subjected to this inquisition of a confirmation process. Like I said, Mr. President, there's more I want to say responding to the Democratic leader's comments, which I couldn't disagree with more. He'd already made up his mind, and so this is now about trying to build a case against the nominee. The problem is there isn't any evidence. And so in its place, what he wants to do is presume the guilt. Because somebody said something in their their high school yearbook, they ought to be disqualified. Because they allegedly threw ice on somebody when they were in college, that's disqualifying. That's making this whole process a laughingstock. This is the opposite of the sort of fair and dignified process that we should be following. But now, at the request of many senators, the FBI is going to be reporting back to the Senate on their supplemental background investigation. Will that be enough to satisfy those who had said all we need is one more week in order to allow the FBI to question more witnesses? Well, we see now that they've moved on. That regardless of what happens with this supplemental background investigation, they won't be satisfied because they had their minds made up already, even before Dr. Ford's letter became public. This is an embarrassing, disgraceful way for the Senate to conduct itself. We do not honor ourselves or this institution by handling this nominee like this, and this nomination, and these witnesses, including Dr. Ford, like this. I don't know what it's going to take for us to change, but one thing can't happen is we can't let these despicable tactics and this strategy win. Because if they're able to destroy the reputation of the sitting judge based on such flimsy stuff, that means this same precedent will be applied to future nominees. And woe be to us. And what a terrible disservice, not only to the good men and women who want to serve in government, but also to the American people. The thing I hate most about Washington, D.C. and its insular culture is that some people don't just want to win the argument. Some people don't want to just win the election or win the vote. They want to destroy their opposition. Destroy them. That's why people are talking about, even if the judge is confirmed, well, maybe over in the House they'll start impeachment proceedings. One of the members of the Judiciary Committee said, if the judge is confirmed, it won't stop there. I'm not going to stop. What does that mean? We need to vote. We need to get the FBI report, and we need to vote. Because the longer this circus continues, the more embarrassing it becomes to the Senate and to the senators who work here.
Mr. President, it's hard to believe it was 3 weeks ago when we first heard the name Christine Blasey Ford. It seems like a lot longer, doesn't it? In that period of time, a lot of things have occurred. The first thing was an announcement from the White House that, and this came from Kellyanne Conway, she said that Dr. Ford's testimony and complaint would neither be ignored nor would she be insulted. Last night at a rally in Mississippi, the President of the United States mocked Christine Blasey Ford for their lack of specific memory about this terrible sexual assault which occurred 36 years ago. I think most people realize that she testified under oath, gave us all the information she knew, and conceded there were things she couldn't remember. Neither she nor any victim should be in any way belittled because they can't remember all the details of something that happened in the distant past and something that they would much rather forget. Let me also remind those who are following this debate, it was Dr. Ford who stepped forward and called for an FBI investigation. She was willing to step forward before the FBI and tell her story. It was Judge Kavanaugh who resisted it even when I asked him directly. Now the FBI investigation is underway. For the good of the Senate and for our nation, I hope that this is a complete, professional, nonpartisan investigation, and I hope that we're given the time to at least read the report from the FBI before the Republican majority leader in the Senate plows through, as he said over and over again, to a vote in this Senate. I would hope that those who come to this issue in good faith, regardless of their position, will be respectful of the process, which we may be using in the future and should respect as it reaches its conclusion.
The most important words of our Constitution are the first three, we the people. This describes the entire purpose of our Constitution. That is to create a government responsive to the people and produce laws that reflect the will of the people. And that requires a close adherence to the vision embodied in the Constitution, including the advice and consent vision in the Constitution. We know that the founders of our country, they struggled with how to appoint people to high positions in the executive branch and to our courts. And it's Alexander Hamilton who laid out the deliberations. He said, well, if a body or an assembly has that power, there'll be a lot of horse trading back and forth, and we won't get the best people suited to the positions in the executive branch and in the courts. So the responsibility should rest with one person, and that's how the nominating power came to be vested with the president. But the founders also discussed the fact that a single person can go off track. The president might have favoritism towards people from his or her home state. The president might favor people who had in turn done favors for him or her, and so forth. So they said the way to avoid this is to have the Senate be a check upon the president, and would tend to greatly prevent the appointment of unfit characters. That's what Alexander Hamilton summed it up. Our responsibility is to review the record of individuals and make sure that no one is appointed who is of unfit character. Well, that separation of powers has been honored over the centuries. President nominating, and then the Senate reviewing the entire record of the individual to honor its responsibility to figure out, is this individual fit or is this individual unfit? But now we have something we have never seen before, which is the president's team has intervened in a massive way to block a thorough review of the nominee's record. Now, there are three parts of this intervention. The first was to weigh in with Senate leadership and say, don't request anything about his 3 years as staff secretary. And there was a conspiracy then between the president's team and a few senators to prevent the entire body from being able to review nominee Kavanaugh's record. That's unacceptable, because each and every one of us have that responsibility. Each and every one of us take the oath of office. This isn't just a responsibility that exists for one or two people who refer to themselves by titles like Majority Leader or Chairman of Judiciary. This is a responsibility that every one of us has, and that responsibility has been violated with this violation of the separation of powers. The second thing that the president did was proceed to appoint an individual to use the stamp presidential privilege, meaning executive privilege, to deny access to the Senate for some 100,000 documents for when the individual served in the capacity of a lawyer on the team of White House counsel. Now, in this case, the Senate did request the records, but this is solely the exercise of the president, and perhaps, therefore, is the clearest example of the violation of the separation of powers. And we have from the individual himself the statement, the White House has directed that we not provide these documents. And that's referring directly to the documents that William Burke marked presidential privilege, 100,000 documents. Now, why are these documents important? Well, we know from the more limited ones we've received that it addresses his actions and his opinions on a host of important topics. Well, the documents reveal, for example, that while he said he wasn't involved in the discussions around certain nominations, we know that, at least in a modest way, he was, from the documents we have. But we don't have the bulk of the documents to explain the whole story. He said he wasn't involved in the discussions regarding the use of torture, but we have a limited glimpse from the documents we did get that he was involved in those discussions. The remaining documents probably have a much more expanded vision of his involvement. He said that he wasn't involved in the receipt of stolen documents that regard nomination discussions, documents stolen from the Senate Democrats, and yet we find out from the existing documents we have that he was, that these were received directly by him. So there we are with this limited glimpse of three cases that he misrepresented the story. Certainly didn't get the full story. Well, what's in the 100,000 documents that were censored, that we never got? We've never been in this situation before, where a president deliberately obstructed the review of the nominee's record in this vast procedure. Now, did the president's team go through carefully and say, oh, well, because of the sensitivity X, Y, and Z, therefore we're going to block documents A, B, and C, and therefore create an index explaining that? No, they did not. We have a whole-scale blockage of key parts of the record. And there's more than that. There's also the president's role in marking documents committee confidential. So, here is the challenge. We have a responsibility, a constitutional responsibility that has been violated. And that's why today I filed a motion to compel the president to provide those 100,000 documents marked presidential privilege to us in the Senate, so we can review them and do our responsibility under the Constitution. Now let me switch topics. I've heard senators here say, well, we certainly couldn't vote for this individual if he lied to the committee in his testimony. That certainly would mean he was unsuited to serve. And yet, we have numerous instances in which he has lied to the committee, and he is unsuited to serve. At a minimum, the president should withdraw this nominee. It is certainly an enormous, enormous dark mark on the integrity of the court to take someone who misled the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, about numerous topics. We had just in those three issues that I mentioned, deception, issues related to did he receive stolen documents? He did. He said he didn't. Was he involved in the proceedings for certain nominees? He said he wasn't, but he was. Was he involved in the conversations over torture? He said he wasn't, but he was. And that's just with the limited information that we have. And then we have the hearing. The hearing in which he said things like his friends who were at the gathering with Dr. Ford refuted her story. Straight out lie. Not a one of them refuted his story. They said they didn't remember. They said they didn't know. They certainly didn't refute. That's a lie. He said she wasn't in the same social circle, but we know she was. She dated his good friend. He said when asked to define certain things like boofing and devil's triangle, he lied to the committee about what those terms meant and what all his friends knew that they meant. They meant things I won't discuss here, but he was not honest with the committee. And the list then goes on and on. He said he wasn't aware of the story until he read it in the New Yorker magazine. Turns out not true, and in fact he intervened to try to, sabotage that story before it was ever printed because he knew about it beforehand. Colleagues, look, there are times that we may have an individual who suits your judicial philosophy, but is totally unsuited to serve on the court. Stand up for this institution. Stand up for the Senate that has been unable to do its responsibility under the Constitution to review this man's whole record. Stand up for the integrity of the committee process and the fact that we don't put people on the court who lie to this body. Stand up for the vision of the United States of America, the vision of a we the people nation, not government by and for the powerful. And yet that's exactly what his decisions stand for. Stand up for the vision of a president and a republic instead of the vision of a king and a kingdom, which is what his view of presidential power turns into, a president above and beyond the law. Colleagues, do your job, and that means we do not vote until we have the documents review his entire record, and when we vote, if he is still the nominee, we reject him because he lied, because he demonstrated intense partisanship, because he's angry under stress, because he threatened retaliation, because he is unsuited to serve on any court, let alone the Supreme Court of the United States of America.
President. Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, my colleague just talked about standing up for the Senate, standing up for the values that traditionally have been our values. One of those principal values has been innocent till proven guilty, not innocent when you you just have that presumption that that's where you are. What we've seen happen here in the last week is something that didn't need to happen, certainly in the way it happened. The hearing, the hours of questions, the picking through apart those answers at leisure, we've seen all of that. You know what would have happened if we'd have followed this process the right way? Now, hard to do when a significant majority of the committee says that they're against the nominee before has the hearing, and several senators say they're against the nominee before he's even nominated, no matter who the nominee would be. But the normal background check that would have occurred if the information that was available to the committee, to Democrats and their staff, would have been turned over at the time, how would they have handled that? How would the FBI have handled that on July the 30th or August the 30th or any other date? They would have handled that by going and talking to the people involved. Dr. Ford, Judge Kavanaugh would have been interviewed by the FBI. That would have been, the people they mentioned that the FBI should also talk to would have been interviewed by the FBI. That would have been put in the file. The material could have been presented to the committee as it should have been. They could have pursued with Judge Kavanaugh's private hearing. They were willing to talk about baseball tickets in the private hearing. They could have pursued in the private hearing, here's what's in this file. What do you have to say about that? Dr. Ford, as she says she wanted to be, would have been kept anonymous in that process. There would have been no reason, unless the committee would have decided to do what somebody on that committee did, to use her name, to bring this into a major public confrontation. This could have been handled in another way. Her letter, her personal trauma could have been handled in a way that it wasn't. In fact, it couldn't have been handled more poorly or politically by some in the minority or their staff than it was. Only after the hearing had ended, after the original hearings had ended, only after it was obvious that Judge Kavanaugh, in my view it was obvious, had the votes to be confirmed, then suddenly these unverifiable charges were made public by the Democrats on the committee and their staff. Now, Mr. President, I work hard to find agreement with my colleagues in the Senate of both parties. I've been the principal Republican sponsor or the principal Republican co-sponsor on legislation with all but 4 of the Democrats in the Senate. So I do my best to find the areas we can agree on. And in fact, this FAA bill today that Senator Cantwell and I chair that subcommittee, Senator Thune and Senator Nelson chair the full committee. The appropriation, a lot of things have happened this year that haven't happened for a while because we've reached out to try to work together. But what we have with this nomination is a new principle. I find the guilty until proven innocent conduct by some of our colleagues totally unacceptable. It is not who we are. It cannot become the new standard. I heard somebody say at a meeting this week, well, if these charges are out there, that person will always be impacted when there's a case before the court that might possibly involve those charges. That cannot be how we pursue the future. We cannot pursue the future thinking that if you're charged with something, you're somehow from that point on unable to do the job that you're eminently qualified for. You know, we have a person here who has 300 Court of Appeals opinions on the most challenging Court of Appeals in the country. More than a dozen of those almost accepted word for word by the Supreme Court. There is plenty to determine judicial temperament. There is plenty to determine whether the judge can do what the judge is supposed to do. Now, unless later today somehow we see something that is highly unlikely based on all the things already out there, I intend to vote for Judge Kavanaugh. I don't think he would have said I categorically and unequivocally didn't do this or anything like it regarding the specific charge if he had. That was not necessary. You wouldn't have to say that about conduct over 3 decades ago. You could say all kinds of other things, but here is a lawyer whose legal capacity has never been challenged. He would not have had to make that unequivocal statement if there was any reason to be concerned about that statement. He says he didn't do it. Everybody else who was asked if they saw it happen, who was mentioned, says they didn't see it. I believe something traumatic did happen to Dr. Ford. I don't believe it involved Judge Kavanaugh. With the obvious, specific, 3 decades later memory of the person involved, you can actually believe, with that exception, you can believe that both of them are telling the truth. I joined Judge Kavanaugh's daughter in praying for Dr. Ford and her family. And I also think we should all pray for Judge Kavanaugh and his family. This is an issue that got totally out of hand. It's an issue that got well beyond the bounds of what we believe in our country. It's an issue that we can't let begin to determine the future way we do these things. Otherwise, anybody is subject. You cannot have guilty until proven innocent. You cannot have guilty until nominated or innocent until nominated as the standard for the country. We cannot let this go forward that way. Some relationships here, and important ones to me and others, are going to take a little while to restore, but we'll have to restore them. There aren't enough of us to walk away from each other and say, we cannot possibly move forward working with you. I intend to continue to work with my colleagues, but I also intend to continue to stand up for the fundamental values of fairness that this country has always held most dear. We need to do that this week with this nomination as well.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today as well to speak about the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to serve on the United States Supreme Court. He was nominated July 9th, 86 days ago today. Even before he was nominated, a number of members of this body stood and said they would oppose the nomination, not even knowing who he or she might have been, that they would oppose the nomination to the Supreme Court. After the name came out that evening, other members of the Senate said, I would oppose that. Chuck Schumer, the Democrat minority leader, said he would oppose the nomination, he said, with everything that he had. You know, it used to be that we could just disregard language like this as empty rhetoric. Not anymore. Now we know exactly what Democrats had in mind from the very start. We have seen the kind of a smear campaign that they have been planning from the very beginning. What I've heard from people at home in Wyoming is that they didn't think things could get any lower in Washington, D.C. until they saw this. Democrats have done everything under the sun to delay Judge Kavanaugh's nomination and to tarnish his reputation. Began with misrepresenting Judge Kavanaugh's sterling judicial record. Well, that didn't work. Then they unfairly complained that they didn't have enough documents by Judge Kavanaugh. When that didn't work, they shifted to surprise attacks on his character. The only thing that they have accomplished is to set a new low for how Democrats treat people in Washington, D.C. You know, there's a way we do things in the Senate to make sure that we can fairly and fully investigate nominees for important jobs. What we've seen is Democrats have absolutely rejected this bipartisan tradition. They hid information for more than 2 months. Then, after Judge Kavanaugh had gone through 4 days of confirmation hearings, Democrats leaked that information to the press. Information that they had been sitting on and hiding from the American people, hiding from the Republicans on the committee, hiding from the judge himself. This isn't the first time that we've seen Democrats try to change the rules when it comes to judicial nominees. The Democrats really do have a double standard. They do it time and time again. They want one set of rules for when there's a Democratic president, and then a totally different set of rules when there's a Republican president. Democrats have had for years something known as the Biden rule, named after then Senator Biden and then Vice President Joe Biden. This Biden rule said you shouldn't confirm a Supreme Court nominee once the presidential election is in full swing. Democrats wanted that rule in place when George Bush was president. Once President Obama was in office, Democrats wanted to pretend they had never said it, never heard of it, and it no longer applied. They wanted a totally different set of rules for considering nominees for a Democrat president than those for a Republican president. Then they had what we saw here in the Senate as the Reid nuclear option. That's when Democrats decided and voted overwhelmingly to get rid of the filibuster for confirming judges and other nominees. Democrats set the rule when they were in the majority, when there was a Democrat in the White House, and they wanted to confirm people that were nominated by President Obama. As soon as a Republican came into the White House, the Democrats who voted to change the rule now complained when the rule that they changed was applied to them. Democrats have a double standard. And now what we see is the Schumer rule. Democrats took the normal process for how we review nominees, and they threw it out the window. Democrats' new rule is this: defeat the nominee no matter what. Democrats are willing to do whatever it takes to delay, disrupt, intimidate, and obstruct this Republican nominee. Democrats haven't just thrown out the standards for how we do our work here. They have absolutely trampled on common human decency. It was bad enough when Democrats were just trying to delay things. They demanded reams of paperwork. Well, senators have been given access to 500,000 pages of records, 500,000 pages of records from the judge's time as a judge and throughout his career in public service. Now, that's triple the amount of information that they've ever gotten about any other Supreme Court nominee. After Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings, he responded to nearly 1,300 written questions from senators. That's more questions than we've had for every other Supreme Court nominee in history combined. But Judge Kavanaugh has served on the Circuit Court here in the District of Columbia, the second highest court of the land, for 12 years. He's written opinions in 300 cases. If anyone wants to know how he'll act as a judge, they should look at how he's already acted as a judge for the past dozen years. These are the documents that matter. These are the ones that tell you how he approaches being a judge. People can look at the 13 cases where the Supreme Court adopted Judge Kavanaugh's reasoning. That's how much respect other judges and justices have for his careful and compelling decisions. Washington Democrats don't seem to care about any of this. Democrats got the documents that they asked for, so they just changed their demands. Now, you can see how transparent Democrats have been by looking at what they said last week. As late as last Friday morning, the Democrats were saying that we should pause for a week. That's what Senator Schumer said. Senator Feinstein, other members of the Judiciary Committee, I said, let's pause for 1 week. As soon as the Republicans said that we would do that, the Democrats said, not good enough. Said it doesn't matter what happens in that week. They're still voting no because it was never for them about finding the truth. For many, it was never about even the name of the nominee because they came out opposing him before his name was even placed in nomination by the president. This has always been about the far left wing of the Democrat Party doing, as they've described it, whatever it takes to push their talking points. It's now all about the politics of personal destruction. Don't seem to care much about what they do and how they damage the people involved. Don't care about the damage they're doing to the Senate, the damage they're doing to the Supreme Court. The American people deserve better than this. It's time for the Democrats to end their charade before they do more harm to the Senate, to the Supreme Court, and to the United States of America. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President, this has the potential of being a historic week in America. The last 10 days have been very troubling to me as a United States Senator, as an individual citizen, husband, father, son. I'm very troubled today by the extreme measures that we see being made right now about a case that my colleagues across the aisle are trying to make today. I'm outraged, actually. After a personal incident that involved my wife and myself this week, we have seen firsthand the length to which members of the other side of this aisle will go to distract us away from the truth. This body, the United States Senate, has become nothing more than a bully pulpit for someone's special cause, when it should be a deliberative body. We should be finding the truth here. My Democratic colleagues claim they want to work together with Republicans. They talk all the time about working in a bipartisan way. And yet, when you get in the heat of the battle, nothing could be further from the truth. This is bigger than confirming Judge Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. This is about civility in our country. People have died supporting our Constitution and fighting for the freedoms that we have in this country. Innocent until proven guilty, for goodness sake. But when that's not convenient with an argument that you're trying to make, it gets trashed. That's what we've seen this week in this body. Mr. President, this is about the common discourse in America. Whoever said that we always had to agree? We don't. But whoever said you had to hate someone if you disagree with them? Senate Democrats have made it clear they're willing to say or do anything to stop the president's agenda, which, by the way, is working. We're growing this economy at twice the rate that we achieved under President Obama. We have over 331 nominees today, Mr. President, waiting to be confirmed. First time in history this has ever been done to this degree. One of my Democratic colleagues called Judge Kavanaugh your worst nightmare. Another called him a nominee who wants to pave the path of tyranny, Mr. President. Yet another said this Supreme Court confirmation would mean the destruction of the Constitution. Seriously. That's irresponsible for somebody in this body. That person said, she said that before Judge Kavanaugh was even announced as a nominee. Worst of all, another one of my Democratic colleagues said anyone who supports Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation is complicit in the evil. I just don't understand that, Mr. President. Really? Senate Democrats want to be reasonable and work together? Seriously? This rhetoric sounds anything but reasonable to me. In fact, I believe my Democratic colleagues have gone one tick too far this time. when paid activists who support you attack my wife, you have gone too far. The American people will know that on both sides. And that didn't start outside this body, it actually started in here. You are inciting this disrespect of our law. One of my Democratic colleagues in this body has encouraged people to, and I quote, get in the face of some of those Congress people. Really? How does that move the cause of justice forward? The House Minority Leader wants to see uprisings all over the country. Seriously? Another member of the House said, and I'm quoting the entire quote here, they're not going to be able to go to a restaurant, talking about Republicans. They're not going to be able to stop at a gasoline station, she says. They're not going to be able to shop at a department store. The people are going to turn on them. They're going to protest. They're going to absolutely harass them until they decide that they're going to tell the president they can no longer hang with him. Same member of the House also said, if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, a department store, or gasoline station, you get out and create a crowd. You push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome. This is America. But these are the tactics of the brown shirts in Germany in the 1930s, Mr. President. Unacceptable. Totally irresponsible. This is outrageous and unacceptable behavior for anyone, but much less a member of this body, a member of Congress, and a member of the United States Senate. You've crossed the line. Inciting dangerous behavior is not something that we should be about in this body. Now, when it comes to Judge Kavanaugh in America, this country was built on a bedrock principle that we were trying to build here in America as opposed to what they lived with under different rule in Europe, and that is this. The presumption of innocence is sacred. An individual here is innocent until proven guilty. That's part of what makes our country so exceptional, Mr. President. Unfortunately, Senate Democrats have become so far removed from getting to the truth that they will stop at nothing to delay this Supreme Court confirmation. That's all this week is about. It's another delay. Any objective observer would agree that Chairman Grassley afforded both Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh an equal opportunity to speak before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee and to the American people. As a matter of fact, Mr. President, any war on women this week, and in this sad story here, has been perpetrated on Dr. Ford by Senate Democrats. She wanted this to be confidential. And this body could have done that. They could have done all the investigation confidentially without dragging her name through the media or Judge Kavanaugh's. You know, some people on the Senate side, the Democratic side of the Senate, want America to believe that this is just a simple case of he said, she said, and it comes down to who do you believe? Well, it's a lot more than that, Mr. President. It's not only she said, he said, but it's a they said. The accuser in this case named 3 people who she said would corroborate her story. Not only did they not corroborate her story, they actually corroborated his story. Senate Democrats were not satisfied even with that. They weren't satisfied that when the letter was leaked to the press, it wasn't given to the committee, when it was leaked to the press, some 6 weeks after it was received by Senate Democrats, 6 weeks, an investigation was started immediately, Mr. President, by the committee, by the Judiciary Committee. Oh, but wait, Senate Democrats chose not to participate. How's that for looking for the truth? Instead, what they did is they waited till we had a hearing and then said, oh no, we need another investigation. We need another FBI investigation that we knew would be totally redundant of what had just been done by federal investigators employed by the Senate Judiciary Committee. But we went ahead and agreed as a committee to do just what you wanted. And that's to allow a full and open FBI investigation into this, which is nothing more than redundant of what had just been done in the prior couple of weeks. Judge Kavanaugh has had 6 6 FBI investigation. This is the 7th formal FBI investigation. Not only that, the minute the committee saw Dr. Ford's letter, it immediately, as I said, went into detail with these outside federal investigators without the help of Senate Democrats who are members of that committee. As a matter of fact, when ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee met with Judge Kavanaugh a few weeks ago, she had been in possession of this letter from Dr. Ford for several weeks, and her staff had already recommended an attorney to Dr. Ford. But in that meeting with Judge Kavanaugh, the first meeting between the ranking member and Judge Kavanaugh, she didn't mention the letter one time. That's in the testimony. She held on to Dr. Ford's letter for 6 weeks before it was leaked to the press. Again, it's clear that for Senate Democrats, this is all a well-orchestrated effort to cause delay and push this decision, hopefully in their mind, past the election. Shame on any member of this body, Republican or Democrat, that puts self-interest and political interest before their constitutional responsibility. The committee has voted favorably to move Judge Brett Kavanaugh's nomination forward. That means it comes to this floor. It's time to take a full vote before this body, before the United States Senate. We hope in the next few hours, next day, to have this FBI report and to put this sad saga to bed. It's time to put partisan politics and delays behind us. It's time to confirm Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. And I want to say one more thing. It's time for this body to reread their oath of office, to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States, to make sure that what we say in this body is the best and the very best America has to offer to move our concerns forward. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, 1 out of 4 women in this country have been a victim of sexual assault. This is an epidemic, and it tells me, and I think the vast majority of the American people, that we need a culture change in the way boys and men respond to women. Last night, President of the United States, instead of understanding that we have to change our culture, instead of understanding that we have got to make it easier for women who have been victims of sexual assault to come forward and tell their stories, got up on a podium in Mississippi and mocked Dr. Ford, made fun of her. Here is a woman who has come forward to do what she thought was right as an American citizen, understanding from day one that she would be attacked by political opponents. And the result of her having come forward was that she has received death threats. She's been separated from her children. She's had Nazis protesting outside her house. That's what she has gone through. And the president's response to her courage is to mock her, to make fun of her. Now, what kind of message does that send to women and men all over this country? Women who are struggling to determine whether, when they come forward, they will be laughed at, they will be rejected. The President of the United States should lead this country in changing that type of culture, making it easier for women to come forward and tell their stories, making it clear to boys and men that in this country that type of behavior is unacceptable. And yet we had a leader of our country, a President of the United States, mocking this woman. And I would hope that every member of this chamber, regardless of your feelings about Kavanaugh, come forward and express disgust and outrage at the behavior of President Trump with regard to Dr. Ford. Mr. President, a number of my Republican colleagues have come forward and they said, you know, at the very beginning of this process, well before the allegations of sexual assault or the veracity of Mr. Kavanaugh, there were people who were coming forward saying they were opposed to the nomination. I plead guilty. I was one of those people. And I announced my opposition to Judge Kavanaugh probably a day after Trump made that nomination. And let me tell you exactly why I came out early against Judge Kavanaugh. And the reason is that for years now, there has been a hard right 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court who have time and time again made rulings that represented the wealthy and the powerful, rulings against the interests of working families, women, the environment, children, and the poor. And based on the statements that Kavanaugh had made over the years, and based on his judicial rulings, I had no doubt that if seated, Kavanaugh would become part of that hard right majority. And I should tell you now, based on the last hearing that took place before the Judiciary Committee, where we saw Mr. Kavanaugh's politics come right out, my initial judgment turned out to be exactly right. If he is seated, he will be part of a hard right that ruled on Citizens United, that billionaires in America have the right to undermine our democracy and spend as much money as they want to electing candidates who represent the wealthy and the powerful. And I fear that if Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court, he will take Citizens United even further. We have a hard right on the Supreme Court by a 5-4 vote that gutted the Voting Rights Act, an act designed to protect minorities from discrimination in terms of their ability to vote. And literally the day after that decision came down, you had Republican governors and attorneys general all over this country working overtime, shamefully, cowardly, to make it harder for poor people, people of color, young people to vote. And I have no doubt that if Mr. Kavanaugh is seated, he will be part of that hard right philosophy. So I apologize to nobody for, within one day of that nomination, saying that I was opposed to it. Now that's my view. Obviously, many of my Republican colleagues, maybe some Democrats, did not reach that conclusion. However, in the past 3 months, and especially in the past few weeks, we have heard credible accusations of sexual assault by several women. These are charges that must be thoroughly and seriously investigated by the FBI. Now, if confirmed, Judge Kavanaugh will have a lifetime seat on the Supreme Court, a lifetime seat. And yet we have the Republican leader and other members saying we have to rush this process along. We have to give the FBI just a few days in order to complete their investigation, because my goodness, we have got to fill that empty seat on the Supreme Court. Now, how hypocritical is that? Let me remind my colleagues that less than 2.5 short years ago, following the death of Justice Scalia, my Republican colleagues simply refused to even consider President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland for a seat on the Supreme Court, and they left that seat open for 10 months until they got a Republican president. So if you could wait for 10 months to fill that empty seat, I think you can wait a few weeks more for us to do a thorough investigation of the charges, the allegations against Judge Kavanaugh. Mr. President, we're dealing not only with Judge Kavanaugh's right-wing political philosophy, we are dealing here not only with the serious allegations of sexual assault, which have to be thoroughly investigated. We're dealing with another very important issue, and that is the issue of veracity. Whether or not Judge Kavanaugh was honest and truthful in terms of his responses to questions asked of him recently and years before when he came before the Judiciary Committee. And I have heard colleagues here say, I think rightfully, that regardless of philosophy, if somebody lies to a U.S. Senate committee, that person should not be seated. So what we need right now, not in a few days period, we need a thorough investigation not only of the charges, the allegations of sexual assault, but also issues of whether or not Judge Kavanaugh has been honest when he came before the Judiciary Committee. And let me give you just a few examples of what I mean that need to be explored. In his previous testimony before the committee, Judge Kavanaugh was asked more than 100 times if he knew about files stolen by Republican staffers from Judiciary Committee Democratic staff. He said he knew nothing, didn't know anything about it when he was in the Bush White House. Yet emails released as part of these hearings show that these files were regularly shared with Kavanaugh while he was on the Bush White House staff. In fact, one of the emails had the subject line, spying. Was Judge Kavanaugh telling the truth, or was he lying? We've got to determine that. In 2006, Judge Kavanaugh told Congress that he didn't know anything about the NSA warrantless wiretapping program prior to it being reported by the New York Times. This year, an email revealed that while at the White House, he might have been involved in some conversations about this program. Was Judge Kavanaugh telling the truth in his response to the committee? In 2004, Judge Kavanaugh testified that the nomination of William Pryor to the 11th Circuit Court, quote, was not one that I worked on personally, end quote, again, when he was in the Bush White House. Documents now contradict that statement. Newly released documents also call into question whether Judge Kavanaugh was truthful that the nomination of Charles Pickering, quote, was not one of the judicial nominees that I was primarily handling, end quote. Was he telling the truth? And if he was not telling the truth on these issues, does that tell us something about the character of this man who wants to take a seat on the Supreme Court? 2006, Judge Kavanaugh testified, and I quote, I was not involved and am not involved in the questions about the rules governing detention of combatants, end quote. New evidence released as part of these confirmation hearings contradicts that assertion. Additionally, now those are issues not dealing with the allegations of sexual assault. But in terms of the recent allegations, Judge Kavanaugh repeatedly told the committee that he never drank to the point of where he didn't remember something. He also denied ever becoming aggressive when he drinks. This is not an issue of whether somebody drinks or not. Millions of people drink. This is an issue of whether or not he was being honest in his responses. There have, as you know, been a number of reports from those people that Judge Kavanaugh attended high school with, attended college and law school with, that contradict his assertion about his drinking habits. Judge Kavanaugh himself, in a 2001 email, referenced growing aggressiveness during a weekend vacation, but that he didn't remember. Again, the issue here is not drinking. The issue is veracity. Was he telling the truth? On another issue, Judge Kavanaugh testified that he treated women, quote, as friends and equals, unquote, and with dignity and respect. Numerous entries in his school yearbook would seem to suggest otherwise. Was Judge Kavanaugh's statement to the committee truthful? Again, whether you like his philosophy or you don't, it is important for us to ascertain the veracity of his testimony. Judge Kavanaugh claimed that he and Dr. Ford, quote, did not travel in the same social circles, end quote. Dr. Ford said she dated Chris Garrett, referenced as a friend in his yearbook. In fact, she testified Garrett introduced her to Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh claimed numerous times in response to Dr. Ford's allegations that, quote, all four witnesses say it didn't happen, end quote, and that witnesses, quote, refuted Dr. Ford's story. Yet one of the witnesses simply said she didn't remember the party in question took place decades ago, but that in fact she believes Dr. Ford. Kavanaugh testified that he had, quote, no connections to Yale, when in fact he was a legacy student whose grandfather attended the school. Kavanaugh also claimed that he had no idea that his mentor and good friend, Alex Kaczynski, was sexually harassing his clerks and creating a hostile work environment. But it was such Kaczynski's behavior was such an open secret that some law schools were warning potential applicants to stay away from Kaczynski. Kavanaugh claims he was not on Kaczynski's infamous email list, but refused to even search his emails to double check. Was Judge Kavanaugh telling the truth about his relationship with Judge Kaczynski? Mr. President, these are very, very serious issues. Millions of Americans are deeply involved and concerned about these issues. Issues not only about philosophy, issues about sexual harassment of women, issues about veracity. This is a question that we have got to get to the bottom of. We do not need artificial time limitations. Let us do it right before we cast a vote on Judge Kavanaugh. And with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President, across the country, women and survivors are angry. They are energized and they are making their voices heard. They are inspired by Dr. Ford and they are sharing stories of their own, often of the worst moments of their lives, and some for the first time ever, with their families, with their friends, and their senators. There are too many to share in one speech here on the Senate floor, but I want to touch on just a few. I heard from a woman in Sequim in Washington State who wrote to me saying, and I quote, "There have been rare moments in my life when I have felt compelled to speak out. This is one." She told me when she was in junior high school, she dated a boy she thought was, quote, one of the nicest guys ever. And then one day she went to his house while his parents were at church, and he assaulted her, tried to rape her, and she only barely managed to escape and run from his house. She said she never told anyone about this because she didn't know who would believe her. She was worried that people would think it was her fault. But she told me that after Dr. Ford found the courage to come forward with her experience, she found the courage to share her own. Another woman from Everett, Washington, reached out to me that shared that she was sexually assaulted in a hotel elevator in the early 70s. She didn't tell a soul for 40 years until just a few days ago. She said that since that day, all those years ago, she has avoided getting into an elevator alone with another man if she possibly could, taking the stairs instead. She told me, quote, "It happened a long time ago, but it still matters," that she was inspired by the women who have so bravely spoken out about Judge Kavanaugh, and that she shared her story with me